Chapter 421. Tang Jiyuan knew that it was cruel to say this, but he still said it. As a father, I still hope that Tang Yu can find a virtuous lady. The one I like the most is the daughter of the Shen family. I've met Miss Pei before. They used to be very close. Pei Chichi's heart was numb as she listened to his words. Parents would always make plans for their children in this way. She smiled faintly. I understand. She did not say anything else. What else was there to say? What was there to say to a strange and pathetic man? At the same time, he was cruel. The way he treated Zhao Ku was too heartless. Pei Chichi raised her head and looked at the middle-aged man who might have been noble in the past, but was still dignified now. She saw a touch of coldness in his eyes. She lowered her head and walked back to the ward quietly. Tang Xin sat there alone. She seemed to have guessed what Tang Jiyuan had said to her. She meowed like a kitten. Chichi, will you come and see me? Pei Chichi did not say anything. She reached out and caressed her little head. Then, she pressed Tang Xin into her arms. Pei Chichi was still young, but when it came to Tang Xin, she felt like a hen hugging a chick. Tang Xin still looked at her pitifully, afraid that Pei Chichi would not want her anymore. After a long time, Pei Chichi said softly, I'll think of a way. Tang Xin cried out and hugged her happily. Chichi, you're the best. Pei Chichi's heart was heavy. How long could she have Tang Xin like this? Tang Jiyuan smoked a cigarette outside. He was not an unreasonable person. He had to let Pei Chichi talk to Tang Xin for a while so that Tang Xin would not feel so bad. From afar, a slender figure walked over and called out, Uncle Tang. Tang Jiyuan turned around and smiled. Oh, it's Shen Lian. Shen Lian smiled. I'm here to see Tang Xin. How is she? Tang Jiyuan's expression softened a little before he said, Pei Chichi is inside. Although Shen Lian was still smiling, it was a little forced. He paused for a moment, and then asked tentatively, did she get back together with Tang Yu? Not really. Tang Jiyuan looked at Shen Lian. Recently, Tang Yu and son Feifei seem to have become distant. Shen Lian, you know, Uncle Tang has always been optimistic about you. It was a cup of love. Shen Lian was like Lin Yun. Hearing this, Shen Lian's face had a touch of shyness. Tang Yu already has a girlfriend. How can I ruin it? Tang Jiyuan patted her. As long as you're not married, you still have a chance. He couldn't let his son marry a flirtatious bitch like Zhao Ku anymore. Just thinking about it made his heart turn cold. All these years, he actually lived with a woman like that. Just thinking about it made him feel disgusted. Through the trial, he had already found out that Zhao Ku was raped by her stepfather when she was in her teens. After that, she fooled around with countless men. He found out through his lawyer, and it made his stomach turn. So, family background was still quite important. At first, he was a little unhappy with the relationship between Shen Lian and Qin Anlan. But thinking about it, it was not a big deal for young people to have a past. What was rare was that Shen Lian had been thinking about Tang Yu all these years. Tang Jiyuan didn't say much, and Shen Lian was considerate and didn't go in immediately. After a while, Pei Chichi came out with a lunchbox. Even though he knew that Tang Xin wasn't Tang Jiyuan's daughter, Tang Jiyuan didn't know. How could he worry about that when Tang Xin's heart was in such a state? Perhaps in Tang Jiyuan's heart, Tang Xin was someone who didn't have long to live. Tang Jiyuan almost fainted at Tang Yu's words. His face darkened. What are you saying? Shen Lian comforted him gently. Uncle Tang, don't hurt your feelings because of me. I'll feel guilty. Tang Jiyuan reached out and patted her. You're the best. Tang Yu sneered and pushed Tang Xin out. Tang Jiyuan tilted his head and looked at Shen Lian's eyes. He sighed. Tang Yu will know how good you are. Chapter 423. It doesn't matter to me, Uncle Tang, as long as Tang Yu is doing well, it doesn't matter if he's with me or not. I think Sun Feifei is a good match for Tang Yu. Tang Jiyuan didn't dislike Sun Feifei, but Tang Yu hadn't been moved by her. It seemed like he wouldn't be able to get together with her for a while. How should Shen Lian put it? She had a relationship with Tang Yu. She had watched Tang Yu grow up and knew him well. She was the kind of girl that Tang Jiyuan trusted. However, he didn't say much about it. Shen Lian smiled and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window. Uncle Tang, I think Tang Yu still can't forget Miss Pei. Look, Tang Yu went downstairs and they're chatting. She sighed. I haven't seen Tang Yu this happy in a long time. Tang Jiyuan frowned and walked to Shen Lian's side. He saw Tang Yu and Pei Chichi talking through Tang Xin. After a while, Pei Chichi squatted down and said a few words to Tang Xin before leaving. Tang Jiyuan's jaw tightened. He saw his son staring at Pei Chichi's back. Uncle Tang, they really love each other. Please don't ruin their relationship and don't change anything because of me. Shen Lian tilted her head and said seriously. Tang Jiyuan didn't say anything. Downstairs, Tang Xin looked up at Tang Yu. Brother, you can't bear to see Chichi leave, can you? Tang Yu grunted and lowered his head. He reached out and patted Tang Xin's head. Tang Xin, call me if you miss me. I'll bring you over for a few days. Can you see Chichi? Tang Xin asked softly. Tang Yu hesitated for a while before replying. A smile appeared on Tang Xin's little face. But after a while, her face fell, and her voice was filled with sadness. Big brother, how's my mom now? Tang Yu was silent for a long time before he sighed softly. She was sentenced for many years. Tang Xin's head hung low. Every strand of her hair was filled with sadness. She raised her face and looked at Tang Yu pleadingly. Big brother, if that day really comes, I want to see mom again. This time, Tang Yu did not hesitate and nodded. Our Tang Xin will grow up well, I promise, he said in a husky voice. My Tang Xin will grow up well. Tang Xin bit her lips and looked at him pitifully with tears in her eyes. There was nothing crueler than this. For a child in his teens, knowing from a young age that he didn't have long to live was such a cruel thing. He didn't know why Zhao Ku and Tang Jiyuan would let a child know these things. It was really disappointing for parents to act like this. Tang Xin whimpered and threw herself into his arms. She was pitiful and her body was still trembling. Tang Yu reached out and hugged her. He didn't say anything. When they returned to the ward, Shen Lian had already left, but Tang Jiyuan was still there. Tang Xin looked at Tang Yu and noticed that her brother's face was a little pale. Tang Jiyuan knew better and didn't mention Shen Lian again. He only asked Tang Yu a few questions out of concern. Chapter 424. Tang Jiyuan said the truth. Think about it, if Sheng Yuan and Jin Taihe join forces, they will not only be the first group in the north, but they will be unrivaled in the whole country. And then? Tang Yu asked calmly. Tang Jiyuan was a little stunned. And then? He said with great difficulty, isn't success in business every man's dream? What about you? Why did you give up your career and abandon your family for a woman? Tang Yu's eyes were burning as he talked about this question with his father for the first time. Can you remember when you were happiest in your life? The elevator opened and Tang Yu walked in. In the elevator, Tang Yu held his forehead with his fingers and smiled gently, a little bitterly. Tang Jiyuan was still thinking about when he was happiest. That was when he and Lin Yun had just married, and when he and Lin Yun had just given birth to Tang Yu. At that time, although he was busy with his career and tired, he was really happy when he returned home. At 8 o'clock in the evening, Pei Chichi went back from the company. She drove downstairs and after turning off the engine, she sat for a long time before getting out of the car. She was wearing high heels and looked a little tired. When she walked to the door, she stopped. At the door, Tang Yu leaned against the wall with a cigarette in his hand and his legs stretched casually, looking very long. The keys in her hand fell to the ground, and the crisp sound of them hitting the ground was heard, but no one cared because he had already thrown away the cigarette, grabbed her with one hand and pulled her into his arms. She was pressed against the wall while the world was spinning. There was a pain in the back of her head and her tears almost fell. Tang Yu put his hand behind her head and reached out to massage her scalp as if he was comforting her, looking at her with deep eyes. She couldn't move for fear that he would kiss her if she moved. But she didn't move and he still kissed her. He kissed her deeply, deeply. Pei Chichi stepped back, and his palm cushioned the back of her head and pressed a little tighter, which made it easier for him to kiss deeper. Pei Chichi opened her eyes wide and looked at him. Not only was his expression filled with hope, but there was also an expression that could be called pain. In the end, she didn't know how she got back into the house. When she came to her senses, they were already on the sofa. Pei Chichi pressed against him, her voice sounded like a kitten. Tang Yu, don't, her eyelashes fluttered in fear. They shouldn't be like this, they shouldn't be like this. However, he did not give her a chance to say no. His large palm moved downwards and his thin lips sucked on the artery on her neck. He had interacted with her countless times and knew her weaknesses. As soon as Pei Chichi kissed him, his body would soften. Sure enough, she was as limp as water in his arms. Her breathing was erratic, and her little head was twisted around in a daze. She looked very pitiful, and her watery eyes were filled with rejection, as if she was begging. But he was unstoppable. Tang Yu leaned forward and kissed her. His lips were hot against her ear. Pei Chichi, you want me? She shook her head frantically. I don't. She was like a hopeless little animal struggling, but how could she escape from his palm? In the end, he still got his way. Pei Chichi cried and fell on his shoulder. She hammered his shoulder and cried, Tang Yu, you jerk. Yes, he was a jerk. But he wanted her, especially today. Chapter 425. At that moment, he realized that he was also fragile and needed to be comforted. He also needed to feel that she was still by his side. In the middle of the night, he was dominating her body, watching her expression as she lost control because of him. It was only at that moment that he realized that she loved him. After the intense moment, everything returned to normal. She was lying on her stomach, but he didn't leave right away. Instead, he lay on the ground with her but didn't let his weight crush her. After a long time, he got up and flipped to the side before tossing the 001 into the trash can. He still remembered that during the most intense moment last night, she hadn't forgotten about it. She had grabbed onto his shoulder and didn't let him come. In his haste, he took out the t-shirt that he had prepared earlier from his pocket. There were about 3 of them in the trash can. Tang Yu took a glance and let out a deep breath. He reached out and pulled Pei Chichi out from his embrace. He laid her there and dominated her for a while. He seemed to be maintaining that position on purpose as he held her with his long arms and legs and didn't let her move. Pei Chichi's waist was a little painful. She moved a little and the man on top of her immediately let out a moan of pleasure. He propped himself up and looked at the sweet little body below. His gaze was deep and Pei Chichi couldn't take that kind of gaze. She turned her face to the side and felt a little uncomfortable. Her breathing was messy and her petite body was still trembling. He was a little satisfied but also a little heartache. He had been too rough earlier on. His fingers caressed her red lips as he carefully felt them. His voice was a little hoarse. Aren't you going to ask me why? Under his teasing, her voice trembled. I don't want to ask. His fingers paused and she immediately felt a kind of tension. Biting her lips, she didn't dare to make another sound. Tang Yu stayed silent for a while before he got up and walked straight to the bathroom. He didn't avoid her and showered in the narrow bathroom. The sound of water entered her ears. Pei Chichi closed her eyes and didn't dare to think that they had done it 3 times. If the first time was because he had forced her, then the last 2 times were because she had acquiesced. She wanted to get up, but her body was limp and she didn't want to move. Just like that, he lay there for a long time until he saw Tang Yu walk out. His sturdy body was only wrapped in a short bath towel, barely covering a certain important part. Droplets of water slid down from his waist and into the bath towel, causing one's thoughts to wander. Pei Chichi just looked at him. Tang Yu glanced at her indifferently and didn't say anything. He pulled out the towel and picked up the clothes on the floor to put them on. When he straightened up again, he looked at her. His nobility did not diminish in the slightest. Pei Chichi, think about our current relationship. Also, we just made love, so what? Pei Chichi's answer was to throw a pillow at him. He had done it and even put on a cold face for her to see. She turned her face to the other side, choosing not to answer him. Tang Yu looked at her almost naked lying on the floor and didn't know how she looked at that moment. His Adam's apple kept moving and his thin lips were tightly pursed. However, he didn't say anything and just left. Pei Chichi bit her lip in anger. She hadn't even eaten dinner and he had already done it 3 times. It was almost 12 o'clock now. She was very hungry, but she didn't have any strength in her body. Chapter 426. She kicked the end of the bed angrily and bit her lips. She didn't even know how cute she looked at that moment. Tang Yu walked to the door and didn't leave immediately. He stood in front of her door and smoked a cigarette. Then, he picked up his phone and called Xiao Ran. Get someone to send a meal suitable for a girl to this address. He gave the address. However, Xiao Ran had been with him for a long time and immediately guessed whose house it was. He was a little surprised. Wasn't the CEO going to be with Miss Sun? Why, did he make up with Pei Chichi again? However, Xiao Ran knew that the CEO wasn't a frivolous person. For him to give such an order, the most important person in his heart must be Pei Chichi. And he couldn't really be with Sun Feifei. Although it was common for men to be fickle, their CEO really wouldn't be. Tang Yu put down his phone, finished the cigarette in his hand, and left. Half an hour later, the super luxurious takeout was delivered by 2 managers. When Pei Chichi took it, she was a little confused. It was Miss Xiao's order. The 2 managers just said that. Pei Chichi immediately thought that it was Tang Yu. She thanked them and returned to the house. At that moment, she was no longer in the mood to eat, nor was she hungry. She looked at the 4 dishes and 1 soup. They looked, smelled, and looked good. Especially the soup, which was made with care. It was a good ingredient for nourishment in spring. She was in a daze for a while. Thinking of his expression when he left, she pursed her lips and sent him a message. I received the food. Have you eaten? On the other side, Tang Yu was driving. It was an early spring night, and his coat was casually thrown in the back seat. He was only wearing a sweater, but he still had half the window open. Hearing his phone ring, he tilted his head and took the phone. He looked at it and saw that it was from Chichi. As for the content, he was a little satisfied, but also a little dissatisfied. He was good to her, and she wanted to repay him a little. He controlled the steering wheel with one hand and dialed Pei Chichi's number with the other. It rang 3 or 4 times before the call was picked up. It was her muffled voice. Is it to your liking? He asked indifferently. His voice was noble and seductive with the night breeze. This was probably the legendary cold wind. Pei Chichi picked up her chopsticks and poked at a small yellow croaker. She bit her lips and said, Have you eaten yet? His voice turned even colder. Yes, I've eaten 3 meals. Miss Pei, have you forgotten? Tang Yu, do you really have to say that? Her voice was small and weak, but there was stubbornness in it. He could almost foresee her brandishing her little claws at him. He chuckled and said in a mocking tone, When I was drenched in sweat, you didn't care whether I ate or not. Pei Chichi was stunned. She had never thought that Tang Yu would be so shameless and childish one day. While she was still in a daze, she suddenly heard the sound of a car crashing. A loud sound rang out. Then came his muffled groan. Tang Yu, Tang Yu. She gripped her phone tightly and stood up, rushing towards the door. Tang Yu, what's wrong? When she reached the door, she remembered that she didn't bring her keys, so she went back and rushed out with the car keys in her slippers. On the other side, Tang Yu's voice was a little weak. He was still sitting in the car, looking at the front of the car that was smoking. And what he had crashed into was the green belt. He had crashed into it himself. Her voice was a little hoarse, and her little face was red from the cold, especially her nose, which looked very messy. Tang Yu was still sitting, but he was no longer smoking. He looked at her deeply. You care about me? His eyes were clear. She couldn't be more familiar with that look. Every time Tang Yu wanted to make love to her, it was the same look in his eyes. Pei Chichi instinctively took a step back, but it was too late. He hooked his arm and pulled her to his side. Separated by a car door, he kissed her. It was deep and rough, almost rubbing her lips off. Chapter 428. The burning temperature of his words almost burned her, and she could smell the smoke in his mouth. Very quickly, she realized that she had been tricked. There was no car accident. It was all a prank by him. All her worries turned into anger. She couldn't take it anymore. In the end, she raised her hand and gave his handsome face a tight slap, slap. So loud. The cars on the road intertwined with each other. The handsome man was sitting in the car while the beautiful girl was standing outside. They were in a stalemate. She wanted to escape. She took a few steps back and wanted to run. She couldn't care less about her car anymore. She had a premonition that she would be devoured by him until there was nothing left of her. She had only taken a few steps when her petite body was hugged from behind. A car brushed past her and suddenly, her waist was hooked by him. Tang Yu stared at her sternly. "Pei Chichi, do you want to die?" She was a little dazed, a little stunned, but more than that, she was in a frenzy. His arms were like steel pincers as he hugged her easily. His face was buried in her neck and his voice was unbelievably hoarse. "Pei Chichi, why don't you dare to admit that you care about me?" Her body was limp and she couldn't move as he hugged her tightly. Raising her head, she felt his thin lips on her neck. Just one bite and he would be able to bite her in half. There was a mortal danger, a mortal temptation. He grabbed her little neck roughly and forced her to turn her head. Just like that, he kissed her again with a burning passion. The night wind was cold, but he was so hot, Pei Chichi felt like she was melting. She closed her eyes and felt very uncomfortable. Her neck hurt. Wherever his tongue and lips touched, she felt numb as if she was being run through by thousands of electric currents, trembling, trembling. After the torrential kiss, he didn't let go of her immediately. Instead, he hugged her and kissed her neck gently, as if he was comforting her. She was still trembling in his arms. She was as pitiful as a reed in the wind. "Pei Chichi, you can't run away." He kissed her and his voice sounded like he was swearing an oath. Then his large palms tore away some of her clothes and he bit into her thin shoulder, biting a bit deep. She let out a cry. It was very painful. By the time he let go, there was already blood. Deep teeth marks were visible on her snow-white shoulder. She was in pain, but he didn't feel sorry for her. He reached out and touched the bite mark. "Pei Chichi, this is a mark. In this life, you are mine." This was his decision. Although it was painful, although it would hurt a lot of people, once he made up his mind, he would not change it. "I told you, you'd better hold on." After saying that, he actually laughed happily. Pei Chichi was stunned and realized something. She didn't know where she got the strength to push him away. In the strong night wind, her clothes were messy. She looked at him. "Tang Yu, do you know what this means?" He looked at her with a smile that was calm and doting. "Pei Chichi, I know that this means that we're going to hell together." But did it matter? She was timid and didn't want to go down, so he dragged her down. She wanted to be a saint, but he wouldn't give her this chance. "Pei Chichi, when did I say that I wanted to be a loyal and filial person? In this life, I have everything I want. I don't want to lose what I have, and I don't want to give it away. It was that simple." She retreated and he moved forward. Chapter 429. "Tang Yu, we can't do this." She wanted to escape, but how could he give her a chance to escape? In her car, he brutally raped her in the back seat. No protection. In the end, both of them caught a cold. Also, it was captured by the surveillance cameras and made the headlines the next day. Chief Zhao had a headache. He had tried to suppress the matter, but it still made the headlines in the entertainment news. The whole world felt sorry for Sun Feifei. Sure enough, the scariest thing in the world was an ex-girlfriend. Sun Feifei's agent was very good at handling things. She took advantage of the situation and held a press conference. Sun Feifei said with tears in her eyes that she would send her blessings to Tang Yu and Pei Chichi. Love couldn't be forced. Sun Feifei left a good name for herself and did well for a while. Tang Yu was wearing a white sweater and grey sweatpants. She held a cup of coffee in her hand and sat on the sofa in the rose garden, listening to Xiao Ran's report. Although Xiao Ran was reporting with a straight face, her eyes were secretly paying attention to him. The CEO looked lazy, and his expression was vaguely satisfied. It was the expression a man would have when he was fully satisfied. Was it really a cold? Xiao Ran thought unkindly, "Are you sure he's not exhausted?" However, she was the most professional secretary and was reporting calmly. In the end, Tang Yu said yes, and she suspected that her CEO didn't listen. "Go buy me a bottle of vitamins." Tang Yu drank a cup of coffee and said casually. Xiao Ran was surprised again, but she still did as she was told. Tang Yu stopped her. "Don't tell Chichi." Chichi. Secretary Xiao's heart skipped a beat. There were two reasons for her heart skipping a beat. First, the CEO called her Chichi instead of Pei Chichi. Second, why would she buy vitamins for no reason? Not daring to think too much, Xiao Ran quickly went out to buy something and gave it to Tang Yu. Tang Yu held it in his hand, then looked at Xiao Ran and lightly said, "You go back to the company first." Xiao Ran nodded, but he couldn't help but look upstairs. After she left, Tang Yu lowered his head and looked at the medicine bottle in his hand. He took out another bottle from the table, replaced it, and threw the rest into the trash can. After that, he walked lazily to the master bedroom on the second floor. When he opened the door, Pei Chichi was still asleep. He looked at his watch. It was already 11 o'clock. But he remembered that she barely had any time to sleep last night. He had dominated her the entire time and almost made her bleed. Placing the bottle on the bedside, he sat by the bed and looked at her. Reaching out, he caressed her delicate little face and asked in a low voice, "Does it hurt a lot?" He hadn't been gentle last night. He had been as rough as he could be. Her body was covered in bruises, and she looked a little unbearable, especially her neck, which was covered in kisses. Last night, he had been so excited that he had almost devoured her. Pei Chichi slowly woke up when he called her like that. She opened her eyes and saw Tang Yu sitting beside her. Her lips were slightly parted. They were rosy and looked very alluring. Tang Yu sat and looked at her quietly, his gaze a little deep. Pei Chichi couldn't stand his gaze. She propped herself up and didn't notice that her pajamas had slipped down to her shoulders. His bite marks could be seen on her small, thin shoulders. It was a mark he had left behind for her. It wasn't as deep as before, but it still looked a little alluring. Chapter 430. Tang Yu couldn't help but reach out to caress it. He caressed it gently, his gaze deep in thought. Pei Chichi's body trembled. She looked up at him, her eyes watery. She was a little afraid when he touched her. "Do you want to get up and eat something?" Tang Yu asked calmly. She shook her head, but the next second, her gaze landed on a small bottle at the side. The packaging of that bottle was birth control pills. She stared at it for a long time before she slowly shifted her gaze back to his face. Tang Yu smiled. "I didn't have time to take precautions last night." "So, these were prepared for her?" Pei Chichi bit her lips and hugged her body with her hands. Even though she had never thought of having a child with him, she still felt a little hurt when he placed a bottle of birth control pills in front of her. "Why? Don't you want to eat it?" He suddenly leaned close to her face. His voice was a little hoarse and low. "If you don't want to eat it, you might get pregnant." "Pei Chichi, are you sure you want to have my child?" When he said the last sentence, his gaze was a little deep. His slender fingers were placed on her chest. "Pei Chichi, tell me, if you say yes, I'll throw this bottle away immediately." And he would do it a few more times. He would do it deeply, deeply, and make sure that she would get pregnant today. How shameless, her lips trembled slightly. She kept looking at his handsome face as if she was possessed and couldn't look away. Tang Yu's lips curved. He chuckled softly and whispered into her ear, "Do you want to have a child?" She was stunned for a long time. She was unable to extricate herself from his gentleness, but when her gaze landed on the bottle of pills again, all her rationality returned. She took the bottle of pills and looked at it, then at him. Finally, she opened the bottle cap and took out a pill. She swallowed it just like that. The two of them were already inseparable. At this time, they really couldn't let another child disturb everything. Moreover, she didn't want this child to be born just like her. Tang Yu's gaze was unfathomable as he stared at her until she finished eating. Pei Chichi thought that he would get angry, but he didn't. Tang Yu only smiled faintly. "Don't you feel uncomfortable eating like this?" As he spoke, he passed a cup of water to her. It was rather miraculous. He seemed to have guessed her choice. Pei Chichi looked at him suspiciously, but she still took it and carefully drank 2 mouthfuls. It was indeed much better. Tang Yu got up and pursed his lips. Let's have lunch together. Pei Chichi was still sitting there. After a long time, she said, I want to take a bath first. He did not leave immediately, but stood there looking at her. Pei Chichi said in a low voice, Get out. Pei Chichi, is there anywhere on your body that I haven't seen before? He raised his eyebrows and leaned against the wall. He had wanted to take out a cigarette, but he seemed to have thought of something and didn't smoke it. He just held it between his fingers. He looked like he wanted to quit smoking. Pei Chichi was a little embarrassed and angry. Everything had gone out of control last night. She didn't even know why she had rolled around with him again, and in 3 different places. Her house, the car, and his place. She was probably too angry. When she got up, she tore off the thin pajamas she was wearing. She stood under the warm sunlight and let him look at her beauty. It was beautiful and alluring. What he couldn't stand the most were the hickeys he had left on her. Looking at these marks, he could think of how impulsive he had been last night. Children of the QQ browser, raise your little paws and vote for your awesome author Tilda. Chapter 431. Have you seen it before? Pei Chichi's black hair fell on her thin shoulders as she looked at him. She didn't care about her fragile state and didn't care that he saw her naked. Anyway, it wasn't like she hadn't seen it before. The 2 of them were in a stalemate. After a long time, he smiled lightly. What else? Pei Chichi, is there anything else I haven't seen? Can you show it to me? Her answer was to throw a pillow at him. Shameless. Tang Yu narrowed his eyes as he watched her enter the bathroom. Her slender figure was quite mesmerizing. After a long while, he suppressed the sudden rise of desire. When Pei Chichi came out of the bathroom, Tang Yu was no longer in the bedroom. She dried her hair and looked at the medicine bottle on the bedside table. Her gaze fell on it for a long time before she looked away. She changed her clothes. Actually, there was nothing much to change. She just wore her home clothes, which made her look like she was the one who lived here. When she went downstairs, she heard sounds coming from downstairs. It was a little familiar, but also a little strange. Who else could it be if it wasn't old Master Lin? I don't agree. Lin Zhennan's voice was like thunder. It could be heard from 10 miles away, not to mention Pei Chichi on the 2nd floor. She stopped in her tracks and held onto the handrail of the stairs as she looked downstairs. Lin Zhennan, Tang Jiyuan, Lin Yun, and the Lin family were all there, as well as son Feifei, who looked innocent. There was even someone Pei Chichi didn't expect. Pei Huan was also there. Perhaps it was because of the sisterly bond. Pei Huan immediately saw Pei Chichi on the 2nd floor. She smiled indiscernibly. Chichi, you really live here. Pei Chichi could roughly guess what had happened. She couldn't escape. She walked downstairs slowly and said calmly, I don't live here. There was just an accident. She looked at Pei Huan and Pei Huan looked back at her. She smiled and said in an evil and charming voice, Pei Chichi, I said that we will fight until we die. No one wants to fight with you. Pei Chichi glanced at her, then walked to the table. Even though there were so many people, Tang Yu still sat at the head of the table and ate elegantly. Pei Chichi quietly sat beside him, and he gently pushed her cutlery towards her. Pei Chichi took small sips of the corn soup. It was so delicious that she wanted to cry. Since last night until now, she had been tormented by him for more than 10 hours. She had not eaten at all and was starving. If he wanted to go to hell, he would eat his fill first. Old Master Lin Zhennan felt that he had been slighted. Tang Yu was like this, and so was Pei Chichi. They didn't even put him in their eyes. He blew his beard and glared at them. Do you still have any respect for me? Tang Yu was almost done eating. He slowly wiped his lower lip and looked at his grandfather and mother. Were they here to interrogate or sentence? He smiled lightly. How is that possible? In B City, anyone who sees Lin Zhennan will tremble. Old Master Lin was finally willing to sit down on the sofa. He looked at his grandson, who was 7 or 8 meters away, and that girl. It was difficult to speak from such a distance. Really, why did they make the house so big? He was already very tired after shouting. Old Master Lin rested for a while and continued with a dark face, in any case, I will not agree to this marriage. He looked at Pei Chichi, and there was a hint of coldness in his old eyes that seemed to be able to see through everything. This girl was born from Zhao Ku. I don't believe that she can be any better. Chapter 432. On the other hand, Pei Chichi was still eating in a daze. If he had known that this day would come, he would have known. She was just trying to make herself look less weak. She told herself that she was Pei Chichi, not a persimmon. She wouldn't let anyone bully her. Tang Yu spoke up, "Grandfather, you've said it yourself. Tang Xin is very lively and innocent. She was also Zhao Ku's daughter. How can that be the same?" Grandpa Lin was furious. He slammed his walking stick on the floor. "Tang Xin is of noble birth, is it?" Tang Yu sneered. "I don't remember you acknowledging my father's character, grandfather." Tang Jiyuan was rebuffed. He couldn't say anything. He was here to join in the fun, but deep down, he didn't agree to it. He didn't agree to it in the past, but this time, he was against it. Grandpa Lin's face turned pale and red. After a long while, he said, "Tang Yu, do you think your mother will agree to this?" Tang Yu's heart sank. He knew that he could ignore his grandfather's objection and Tang Jiyuan's obstruction, but he couldn't ignore his mother's wishes. Lin Yun's gaze landed on her mother's face. Her expression was calm as she said, "Tang Yu, this doesn't concern me alone. It concerns both the Lin and Tang families." Her meaning was clear. Even she didn't agree to it. Tang Yu looked around and smiled. "I understand. Are you here today to make your stand, or are you here to make a decision for me?" His gaze landed on Sun Feifei. "You too." Sun Feifei waved her hand. Her face was bitter. "I just didn't have a choice." Tang Yu smiled. "I don't care whether you have a choice or not. This is my family's matter. Miss Sun, please go back." Sun Feifei's lips moved. She looked at Grandpa Lin cautiously. Grandpa Lin didn't stop her. Sun Feifei ran away like a mouse. Pei Huan looked a little anxious. What was going on? She sneered. "Pei Chichi, do you think you'll be fine just because you're hiding behind Tang Yu?" She looked at Pei Chichi and said with hatred, "You and your mother are both scheming bitches. You purposely provoked my mother and made her go crazy. You set up Zhao Ku. That's your biological mother, Pei Chichi. I really couldn't tell that my mother had raised a wolf for so many years." Pei Chichi also finished eating. She lowered her eyes and smiled faintly. In a very soft voice, she said, "I owe Tang Yu. That's why he didn't go overboard with me. I owe my father, so I must avenge him." She raised her eyes. That pair of eyes, which were stained with coldness, was actually so breathtaking. "As for me and Madame Zhao Ku, I think I'm cruel." Pei Chichi smiled faintly. That smile was filled with pain that only she could understand. She had sent her mother to prison with her own hands. She had caused Tang Xin to lose her mother. Her gaze fell on Tang Yu. She stared at him for a long time before saying, "As for me and Tang Yu, you're thinking too much." She had no intention of explaining too much. She didn't owe these people anything. She didn't need to be responsible for their psychological state. They could think whatever they wanted. She walked towards the door. Tang Yu was still sitting there, but Pei Huan blocked her way. "Pei Chichi, do you think you can get rid of everyone with just a few words?" Pei Huan's voice was a little sharp. "You're not allowed to leave until you make things clear." Chapter 433. What are you talking about, Pei Huan? It's true that Auntie hired the hitman, isn't it? It's also true that she embezzled public funds, isn't it? Pei Chichi asked coldly. Pei Huan was speechless for a moment. Pei Chichi sneered. "Pei Huan, did you lose your sugar daddy? How much did you sell this information for?" Pei Huan was a little annoyed. She glared at Pei Chichi. "What nonsense are you talking about? You know very well whether I did or not. Pei Chichi didn't want to be entangled with her. She turned around and looked at everyone. She smiled indifferently. Mr. Tang and I are just friends. She looked down and laughed at herself. It's just a little expensive. After saying that, she walked straight out of the door. Tang Yu stopped her. Wait a minute. Pei Chichi paused and turned around. Tang Yu's expression was unreadable. I'll get the driver to send you back. He paused and said, you still have to take 2 more contraceptive pills upstairs. I'll get someone to bring them to you. Contraceptive pills? Did everyone hear this keyword? Tang Yu ordered the maid to go get it while he looked at the people around him. Pei Chichi and I don't plan to get married, so we naturally won't have children. Why? Is it strange? Old Master Lin's old face was completely black. Don't get married? Then what kind of relationship would they have? He even forced a girl to take contraceptive pills. Tang Yu, don't go too far. Old Master Lin was the first to come out and shout. This was too outrageous. How could he do this? If word got out, wouldn't people laugh at him? A man bullying a weak woman? Too far. Tang Yu chuckled and wiped his hands with a napkin. His movements were elegant and noble. He said indifferently, this is too far. He shifted his gaze to Pei Chichi. Pei Chichi, you played with my feelings and body. How is this too far? These words could not be listened to. Most of the people present were of the older generation. How could they hear such words? Their faces were all red. I'm so impatient, so impatient. Pei Chichi pursed her lips and looked at him. Tang Yu threw down the napkin in his hand, but his words were directed at the old man. I will do more to her in the future. He paused for a moment and smiled faintly. There will be many more things that you won't like. The old man was so angry that he almost fainted. He shouted with all his might, I say, why are you getting angry with a little girl? From today onwards, don't see each other anymore. As for your marriage, your mother and I will arrange it for you. I'm the one who wants to torture her. Tang Yu chuckled. Not only you guys, I also think she's very hateful. As Tang Yu spoke, he slowly walked to the door. Pei Chichi stood there in a daze. What was he saying? Tang Yu walked to her slowly, looking noble and elegant. He bent down and looked down at her. Pei Chichi, I've said it before. You won't have an easy time in the future. His fingers pinched her little chin. So you have to hold on. He paused for a moment and smiled again. He said in a low voice that only they could hear, of course, you have another choice. You can tell these people now that you want me. You want to be with me. Pei Chichi's eyes widened as she looked at him. Suddenly, she understood his intentions. Everything was to protect her. Everything was because of him. But on the other hand, he was forcing her to return to him. Pei Chichi didn't say a word. She just looked at him and turned to leave. Chapter 434. With one hand in his pocket, Tang Yu watched coldly as the coward left. The luxurious hall was silent. No one knew what to say. Originally, the focus was on Pei Chichi's background and how she was raised by that bitch. How did it turn into Tang Yu forcing Pei Chichi to satisfy his selfish desires? No one could look straight at this scene. Lin Yun wanted to say something, but as a woman, she naturally couldn't say anything. She just sighed. She really couldn't become a mother-in-law and daughter-in-law with Pei Chichi. Even if they didn't have to live together, they couldn't help but feel estranged. The first time she saw Pei Chichi, she felt that she looked familiar. She looked similar to Zhao Ku when she was young. She thought it was a coincidence, but who would have thought that it was Zhao Ku who gave birth to her? If Zhu Mailin hadn't gone crazy and told Pei Huan, they might never have found out. Lin Yun later thought that when Pei Chichi ran away from the wedding, she probably knew the truth. She didn't feel good. As a mother, how could she not know what Tang Yu was thinking? He could only bluff the old man with this kind of attitude. She felt a little sour in her heart. Tang Yu was worried about her, but her son still wanted Zhao Ku's daughter. Grandpa Sheng was reluctant. He looked at Tang Yu and said, "Are you going to give up all of us for the sake of that girl?" Tang Yu lowered his eyes and chuckled softly. His chuckle was light and somewhat bitter. He said slowly, how would I dare? But if you force me, then I will give up what I can. For example, Sheng Yuan's position, shares, or the future inheritance rights of the Lin family. This time, Old Master Lin was so angry that he almost fainted. This kid was forcing him to abdicate. Advancing by retreating, he was playing 666. But as angry as he was, he didn't dare to push Tang Yu too far. If he didn't do anything, would these old bones have to go back to work in the company? What a joke! They left as quickly as they came. However, Pei Chichi was unwilling to give up. He felt that it was too easy for Pei Chichi. But she still got 10 million. However, even 10 million yuan couldn't keep her going for long. She was used to spending money, and when the wife of the man she was with found out about her, she went to King Entertainment to slap her in the face. Recently, she couldn't even get a decent job, let alone a commercial or a role in a film. No matter how unwilling Pei Huan was, she had no choice but to leave. However, she did not expect, the next day, Sheng Yuan dropped a shocking bomb. During the morning meeting, Tang Yu announced that he would be acquiring the Pei Corporation. The group of executives sat there, not daring to make a sound. CEO, if you say you don't want to acquire it, then we don't want to acquire it. Now you say you want to acquire it, then we'll acquire it. Anyway, everything is fine as long as you're happy. Meng Qingcheng could not help but sigh. How much love did one have to put in so much effort? They were chasing each other to make things difficult for Pei Chichi. Even if they were to make things difficult, they were only making things difficult for Tang Yu. His love was so pure and simple. For this, Sheng Yuan even called for a grand press conference to announce Tang Yu's decision in a very high-profile manner. Everyone in Sheng Yuan felt that there was no one else like this. Shouldn't an acquisition be done in secret? Shouldn't it be done secretly? Shouldn't it be done in secret? Shouldn't it be done in a victorious manner? Shouldn't it be done in the dark? He had made it so high profile, but the other party wasn't willing. Was it a life-and-death struggle? After the press conference, Meng Qingcheng went to Tang Yu's office. Tang Yu sat in his office chair and focused on flipping through the files. Meng Qingcheng sat at the corner of his desk and sighed slightly. I was wondering why you got angry with a young lady. I admit that Pei Chichi is very good-looking, but there's no need to do this. What do you mean? Tang Yu didn't look up, his voice indifferent. Meng Qingcheng sighed softly. You know. Who did you make such a big fuss for? You still say it's revenge. That can only fool the old master. Pei Chichi's heart is as clear as a mirror. You spoil her, so she falls for it. Chapter 435. Tang Yu put down the pen in his hand and looked up at Meng Qingcheng. After a while, he chuckled and said, Qingcheng, I'm serious. Meng Qingcheng frowned and said, You mean? Tang Yu pursed his lips and leaned against the back of the chair. I'm serious about taking revenge on her. I'm serious about buying Pei Enterprises. He just wanted her. He wanted her to love, hate and have scruples only for him, Tang Yu, in her world. Their relationship had nothing to do with others. He even knew that his mother would look for her alone. Tang Yu didn't want to interfere and let her deal with it on her own. In his heart, he felt a little uncomfortable. Actually, he did not need to worry about her. Right now, she had an indestructible body. She was such a small thing, but she was so stubborn. Meng Qingcheng was stunned for a long time before he said, Tang Yu, you're crazy. Tang Yu laughed at himself and held his forehead. After a while, he chuckled and said, I'm crazy. I've been crazy since the first time I saw her. Otherwise, why could he only touch Pei Chichi out of so many women? Otherwise, why did he only like her when so many women wanted to love him and get his love? He liked her so much that he was willing to give up for her. He liked her so much that he was willing to bear everything for her. He understood Old Master's thoughts. Meng Qingcheng didn't say anything else. He was a pervert. He didn't know how much love Tang Yu had to have to go against the whole family to be with Pei Chichi. Tang Yu was actually taking everything on himself. It was impossible for Pei Chichi not to know that. However, if one's obsession was too deep, it would hurt both others and oneself. Meng Qingcheng could understand Pei Chichi's decision. With such a complicated relationship and such deep hatred, no one would be able to get over it. Pei Chichi wasn't running away. She just couldn't face it. He hadn't seen the scene that day, but he had heard about it. In ancient times, it would be called a tripartite trial. Pei Xiaoqi was just a little girl, and she was thin-skinned. If it were someone like Pei Huan, she would have just thickened her skin and let it go, crying and begging to be with Tang Yu. However, Pei Chichi was Pei Chichi. She wouldn't do that. The more conflicted she was and the more she resisted, the more Tang Yu couldn't let go. Meng Qingcheng was about to go out when the door opened. There was a sense of urgency. Pei Chichi walked in front while Xiao Ran followed closely behind. He looked like he was trying to stop them, but he was actually watching the show. He cleared his throat and said, "President, Boss Pei insists on seeing you." She made a helpless expression and Meng Qingcheng shrugged. "Take your time." He walked out and gave Xiao Ran a look. Of course, Xiao Ran understood and walked out with him. Pei Chichi stood by the door. Tang Yu looked at her, lowered his head, and flipped through the documents seriously. Chapter 436. Pei Chichi, don't you know what I want to do? His gaze landed on a certain part of her body, and the hint was obvious. That what was referring to was her. Pei Chichi was a little embarrassed and angry. She raised her hand to slap him. However, a large palm grabbed onto her small, slender arm, and he held her hand easily. "Pei Chichi, who allowed you to have such a bad temper?" He stared at her, not letting go of any expression on her face. She was stunned for a moment, and then she looked at his cold face. Suddenly, she understood. He did all of this because of something. She was a little flustered and a little confused. The more stubborn he was towards her, the more afraid she was. She wanted to break free, but she could not do so. Not only did he not loosen his grip on her arm, but he even pulled her over to the desk. He sat there, looking at her disheveled look, as though he was looking at a little pet struggling in despair. "President Pei, I never joke." His long fingers gently caressed her red lips, and his other hand pressed against her back to prevent her from moving. This posture was really too embarrassing and angry. The moment Pei Chichi moved, he pressed her down and said in a low voice, "If you don't want anything to happen on this desk, you'd better behave." Pei Chichi was so angry that she bit him hard. Tang Yu did not break free and let her bite him. Until Pei Chichi tasted a trace of blood. She suddenly let go and looked at him helplessly. Tang Yu retracted his finger and gently licked the trace of blood. He smiled faintly and said, "President Pei, your anger has subsided. If that's the case, I still have something to do." He stood up and walked towards the door with a stack of documents in his hand. Pei Chichi hurriedly climbed down and chased after him. Just as he was about to open the door, she tugged at his sleeve. "Tang Yu." He turned his head and looked at her deeply. Then, she was pressed against the wall. He frantically kissed her lips, her neck. She wanted to struggle, but she was rudely pressed against the door again. Her hands were raised high above her head, and her body was pressed tightly against him. She could also feel his impatience. Tang Yu just kissed her and nibbled on her neck. He did not do anything else. But Pei Chichi herself knew that her body had surrendered to his superb skills. After a long time, he buried his face in her hair and said in a low, seductive voice, "Pei Chichi, you sent yourself here." She was trembling uncontrollably and could barely stand on her legs. "Next time, you won't be so lucky." He bit her little ear. "Go to the lounge and tidy yourself up." Pei Chichi hugged his waist and did not let go. She had not recovered yet. Tang Yu bit her again. "Boss Pei, do you want me to continue?" She struggled but could not break free. Her voice was like that of a kitten. "Tang Yu, what exactly do you want?" He did not care about the Pei Corporation. Moreover, the Pei Corporation's only piece of land was now his. "How could you not know what I want?" His large palm held her sharp little chin. "Pei Chichi, all I was waiting for was a sentence. As long as she said that everything would stop, then he would stop. As long as she said that she did not care about everything, he only wanted to be with him. Then, they would be together. He had done so much, and she was so young. He did not know if she could understand. She looked up at him. How could she not understand? But he clearly knew. He clearly knew her situation. Chapter 437. Lin Yun had told her very clearly that she could not accept Zhao Ke's daughter. Tang Yu knew this as well. That was why Tang Yu did not bring Tang Xin to her despite his love for Tang Xin. That day, Lin Yun left first and Pei Chichi sat alone in the cafe. She felt the same as when she first found out that Zhao Ke was her mother. However, she was no longer the little girl she used to be. She would not cry or admit defeat easily. At that moment, she looked at Tang Yu and said with a trembling voice, "I won't give in." She thought that he would be angry. After all, everything that he had done these past few days showed that he was angry. However, he looked at her and smiled. His thin lips pressed against her ear. "Pei Chichi, I don't want you to give in either." He paused for a moment. His thin lips seemed to have become hotter. His voice was low and hoarse. "I like it better when you're above me." She was so embarrassed that she kicked his leg. How could he make such a joke when she was in so much pain? Pei Chichi was angry, but he was in a good mood. Her anger meant that she cared. If she was not angry, he would be even angrier and the consequences would be more severe. He let go of her and tidied his clothes in front of her. He looked like a beast in disguise. "I'm going to the meeting. President Pei, I hope that you can fight back the next time you come." He reached out and ruffled her messy hair. "I'm looking forward to it." "Oh yes, remember to tidy up." He kindly reminded her and walked out after he finished speaking. He was not afraid that she would run away. After all, she would have something to ask of him. For example, Tang Xin. When Pei Chichi walked into the washroom and saw her sorry state, she almost went crazy. Her hair was like a bird's nest, and a few buttons on her clothes were torn off. What was worse was that he had bitten her neck so hard that he seemed to have done it deliberately. Her face was red, and so was her little mouth. It was bright red and especially alluring. She looked at herself in the mirror. It was obvious that she looked dissatisfied. Damn it. She had nowhere to vent her anger, so in the end, she childishly wrote the word bastard on the bathroom mirror with lipstick. Only when she came out did she feel better. However, Pei Chichi was still too naive. She wasn't wearing a turtleneck today. Even with her hair down, the two obvious strawberries on her neck couldn't be hidden. All the employees of Sheng Yuan knew her. As she walked over, she received many ambiguous gazes. When Pei Chichi walked out, her face was burning. She wouldn't dare to come again in the near future. Tang Yu felt that he was already very patient with her. But in the eyes of others, his patience was extremely soul-stirring. Because of Sheng Yuan and Tang Yu's stance, the Pei family had become a piece of fragrant meat, while Pei Chichi was a piece of juicy meat. No one dared to move, no one dared to eat. However, everyone knew that it was necessary to step on them. If they didn't step on them, how would Tang Yu come to buy them? Overnight, the Pei family was besieged. All the partners withdrew their cooperation, even if they were losing money. Every day, Little Wen went in and out of Pei Chichi's office countless times. It wasn't good news. Pei Chichi became busier and more tired every day. But no matter how tired or busy she didn't forget about Tang Xin. She was worried about her, worried about whether she was doing well after returning home, and whether there was anyone to take care of her. Chapter 438. Pei Chichi returned home exhausted. It had been almost a week since she last saw Tang Yu. She was worried about Tang Xin. There were a few times when she wanted to call Tang Yu to ask him how Tang Xin was. But every time she picked up the phone, she would put it down again. 10 o'clock at night. She sat on the sofa alone, watching TV. She did not know what was on the TV, but she knew that it made the house feel less lonely. The phone beside her rang. Her body jerked a little, and then she stared at the phone without moving her eyes. It was Tang Yu. She wanted to touch the phone, but she did not dare to. She just sat there, not daring to touch it for a long time. After a long time, she finally picked it up. But it was not Tang Yu's voice. Instead, it was Tang Xin. Chichi. Pei Chichi was surprised. Tang Xin, where are you? Tang Xin glanced at Tang Yu, who was leaning against the wine cabinet, and said softly, I'm at my brother's place. Pei Chichi pursed her lips and thought about it. Tang Xin took Tang Yu's phone and made the call. She was silent. Tang Xin called softly and coquettishly, Chichi, can you come and see me? It's not easy for me to come out. I have to go back tomorrow. Pei Chichi was conflicted. Why did she go to Tang Yu's place? He wanted to buy over her company and mess with her. Moreover, the whole world did not think that they would succeed. She had also said that they were friends. Now that she was in a hurry to go there at night, there was something unclear. After hesitating for a while, Tang Xin pouted and looked at her brother pitifully. Chichi, don't you like me anymore? This time, Pei Chichi's heart completely softened. She coaxed in a low voice, I'll be there in a while. Tang Xin's voice immediately became light. Okay, I'll wait for you. After hanging up, she returned the phone to Tang Yu and pouted. Big brother, when are you going to return my phone to me? Tang Yu held the glass of red wine in one hand and placed the cell phone in his pocket with the other. He stroked her bald head and smiled. When you're obedient. Tang Xin narrowed her eyes. Since when was she disobedient? However, she still behaved obediently. Big brother's words are all right. It was all the truth. He could not refute it. Pei Chichi arrived an hour later. She was wearing jeans with a long grey sweater and a pair of sports shoes. It was obvious that she was in a hurry. The maid welcomed her respectfully and whispered, Miss Tang Xin is asleep. Do you want to go upstairs and have a look? Asleep? Pei Chichi was stunned. Then what did she come to see? But thinking about it, Tang Xin's health wasn't good. It was normal for her to fall asleep at this hour. So, he nodded. Thank you. The little maid smiled and brought her upstairs. Tang Xin's room was pink in the style of a princess. It was also a little playful. Tang Xin's small body was lying under the blanket. It was so small that it was almost invisible. Pei Chichi slowly walked closer. Just looking at her made her heart ache. She was so small, but she had to endure so much pain. Moreover, Tang Xin could always smile. She sat down and reached out to touch Tang Xin's little face. Tang Xin was sleeping soundly. Her little face was warm. Pei Chichi looked at her and her heart softened. Tang Xin always called her Chichi. She wondered if she could call her sister in the future. Chapter 439. However, after some thought, she decided to call Tang Xin Chichi. She hoped that Tang Xin would never know that she had such an innocent and adorable sister. She would bear the darkness alone. Pei Chichi could not help but lower her head and put her face close to Tang Xin's. She felt a warmth that she had not felt for a long time. She was her blood relative. She had flipped through many medical books to understand Tang Xin's illness. However, she knew that if it was that easy, Tang Xin would not have to suffer so much. She's asleep. Don't wake her up. Tang Yu's voice came from the door. Pei Chichi looked up and saw him standing by the door in a black sweater with an empty wine glass in his hand. She looked at Tang Xin again. Although she was reluctant and knew that Tang Xin would be disappointed tomorrow, she still stood up. She walked to the door and said softly, I'm leaving. He looked at her and did not move away. I'll walk you downstairs. Pei Chichi pursed her lips but did not reject him. She did not dare to do anything to him. If she wanted to see Tang Xin, she had to go through Tang Yu. Although she was angry, she had no choice. She clenched her fists and stared at the man walking in front of her. When she was halfway down the stairs, Tang Yu suddenly turned around and blocked her way. Pei Chichi was shocked. She pursed her lips and looked at him. Tang Yu said calmly, President Pei, you're a sentimental person. I couldn't tell that you have such a deep sisterly bond. She was used to his sarcasm. She did not make a sound and just looked at him quietly. Tang Yu's face was cold. Let's go. He turned around. She thought that he was going to leave, so she started to move down. However, he did not move. She directly lay on his back. She gasped. Before she could react, he had already grabbed her and pressed her into his arms. Pei Chichi could not move. She did not dare to scream for fear of waking Tang Xin up. He did it on purpose. He deliberately lured her here. Pei Chichi, you're good to everyone. Pei Ming, Tang Xin. How could you be so cruel to me? He lowered his head and leaned very close to her. Pei Chichi gritted her teeth. Let go of me. Tang Xin will wake up. His thin lips moved to her ear, and his voice was a little hoarse. In a while, you lower your voice, and she won't wake up. Pei Chichi was stunned. Then, she struggled and said, Tang Yu, you're crazy. We can't have sex anymore. But he had already started kissing her, holding her in his arms and kissing her. He kissed her deeply. When she wanted to move, he held her down and used the most shameless method to touch her inside and out. Pei Chichi's small fist pounded on his shoulder, but it was nothing to him. Didn't you say that we're pals? If I don't do it, how can it be counted? His breathing was also a little chaotic, as if he had been holding it in for a long time. She was pressed against the armrest, and when she looked down, it was empty. It was a little scary. Pei Chichi screamed. Tang Yu kissed her and at the same time, took her. He admitted that he was despicable and shameless, but he wanted her. He could not control himself. He leaned against her neck and panted passionately. For the first time, Pei Chichi knew that a man could sound so good when he was doing it. In the middle of the night, in the dimly lit hall, there were suppressed voices of a man and a woman. Chapter 440. Pei Chichi knelt down and looked at the man in front of her. Tang Yu pinched her little chin and kissed her deeply. Over and over again, she sank into depravity, and cried over and over again, late at night. She lay on her stomach like a little beast in despair. Tang Yu bit her shoulder and said in a low voice, Pei Chichi, are you comfortable? She couldn't speak. She begged again and again. Her voice was hoarse, but she couldn't stop him. She curled up and closed her eyes. Tang Yu, he finally let her go and flipped to the side to calm himself down. Pei Chichi moved a little and wanted to get up. He pressed her down and said, we'll leave tomorrow. As he said that, he got up and walked to the bathroom to take a shower without avoiding her. When he came out, he was only wearing a bathrobe with the belt loosely tied. Pei Chichi still lay on her stomach and didn't want to move. Even she couldn't figure out if they were really pals. Tang Yu slowly walked to the bedside table and took a cigarette from it. He lit it up skillfully, took a puff, and walked out. He left just like that. Pei Chichi was a little speechless. She looked at the direction he left and didn't know what to do. She lay on her stomach. Late at night, it was the calmest place. She was thinking about what her relationship with Tang Yu was now. Was it purely a physical relationship? She didn't know and didn't want to. She let her imagination run wild and got sleepy as she thought about it. She lay there and fell into a deep sleep. Late at night, Tang Yu returned to the bedroom from the study. After walking in, he stood there for a long time before sitting next to her. Pei Chichi was still lying on her stomach in the same position. Her long black hair fell on her shoulders and she looked breathtakingly beautiful. Tang Yu's fingers gently stroked the bite mark on her shoulder. He had bitten her very deeply and he didn't know how he could be so cruel. His fingers caressed her delicate skin, but he couldn't control himself just like that. He was at a hot-blooded age, and he hadn't touched her for a week. Now, just thinking about having a child with her made him feel like he could stay with her for 3 days and 3 nights without getting tired. But Chichi, I still feel lonely when you're by my side. This kind of coercion, this kind of method, in the end, even if you and I are together, even if you are pregnant, you will still hate me. He hugged her from behind and carefully placed her in his arms. It was only when there was no one else around that he could put her in his arms with peace of mind. To himself, to her, to admit that he loved her, deeply loved her. Pei Chichi, this time, I will wait for you here, waiting for you to walk over. I'm waiting for you to say you love me. His face was pressed against the back of her neck, and he was not sleepy at all. He had waited far too long for this embrace. He had never thought that one day, he would have to make do with someone like this. It was obviously easier to give up, but he couldn't do that. No matter what, he wanted to be with her. Pei Chichi, I don't want to be alone in loneliness and pain. If you want to be in pain, let's be in pain together. He was in a good mood. He reached out to hug her and put his lips on her little neck. Just like that, he would sleep with her. In the trash can at the side, countless 001s felt wronged. Master, I'm very expensive, okay? Even if you want to use it, you can't poke holes in our bodies. This will affect the effect, and we will get pregnant. Chapter 441. The good thing about staying in the rose garden was that she could see Tang Xin the next day, and she wouldn't be disappointed. But there was also a downside. Tang Xin woke up early and ran to Tang Yu and Pei Chichi's bedroom. She yanked the blanket away. Chichi, I knew you didn't. Go. Her last word was a little frightened. Chichi. Chichi. Tang Xin's voice was trembling. I didn't know you weren't wearing clothes. Tang Xin felt that she was doomed. Her demon brother had already woken up. He opened his eyes and glared at her. He quickly covered Chichi with the blanket. Her brother's voice was unprecedentedly stern. Get out of here first. Tang Xin stared at him. She was stunned for a moment, but she was still frightened by her demon brother's gaze. Pei Chichi curled up in the blanket, feeling a little embarrassed. She really wasn't wearing anything. When she opened her eyes, she saw his muscular body in his bathrobe. Without batting an eyelid, she took a few steps back and pursed her lips. When she looked up, she saw his deep gaze. Hurry up, we can do it again. His finger caressed her slightly parted lips. His voice was a little hoarse. Pei Chichi immediately jumped off the bed and ran to the bathroom. Even Tang Yu couldn't help but laugh. Now he knew the best way to wake her up. Pei Chichi tidied herself up and went downstairs in yesterday's clothes. Tang Xin was already sitting at the dining table, waiting for breakfast. Pei Chichi came downstairs, and Tang Yu slowly followed behind. Today, he wore a white shirt, a V-neck sweater, and a pair of well-ironed trousers. He looked very elegant. Pei Chichi sat down and reached out to pinch Tang Xin's little face. Don't do that again. But she didn't expect Tang Xin to be so picky with her words. She rolled her eyes and asked with a smile, Chichi, so you still want to lie naked with me in the future? Pei Chichi blushed. She glared at Tang Xin. Eat breakfast. Chichi, it's funny when you're angry, Tang Xin said seriously. On the side, Tang Yu was reading the newspaper. Although he didn't say anything, there was a slight smile on his lips. Tang Xin continued to ask fearlessly, Chichi, isn't that right? Isn't that right? Pei Chichi did not answer her. She lowered her head and ate her breakfast. After eating, she would go to the company to work hard. And the one who made her so desperate was none other than the demon brother that Tang Xin had mentioned. Her relationship with Tang Yu was very complicated, and she couldn't figure it out herself. When he oppressed and pressured her, she hated him. However, as long as he treated her with the slightest bit of tenderness, she would forget everything and willingly stay in his embrace. Did someone say that there was no such thing as absolute freedom in the world? The reason why women could succeed was mostly because they enjoyed the process. She and Tang Yu were probably the same. Pei Chichi pursed her lips and didn't say anything else. After eating, she looked at Tang Xin. I have to go to work. Next time, call me. Tang Xin was especially childish. Chichi, are you embarrassed? Pei Chichi said coldly, no. Chichi, you are. No. You're obviously blushing. Pei Chichi took a small bun and stuffed it into Tang Xin's little mouth. Shut up. Chapter 442. Yes. Her brother folded the newspaper and chuckled. She will only be more rude than this. Rude. Above. Torturing her brother like crazy, Tang Xin's eyes were filled with countless little stars, yearning and worship, but it was only for a while, because Chichi was leaving. Her mother left her, and Chichi also left her. Tang Xin's little face fell. She hung her head dejectedly and tears streamed down her face. Chichi, I know you don't like me anymore. I'll lift your quilt. Pei Chichi was a little shy at first, but now it was inappropriate for her to leave. She walked back and looked at her pitiful face. Why are you crying? Tang Xin continued to be pitiful. Chichi, you don't love me anymore. Pei Chichi was a little helpless. She reached out and caressed her long hair. Her voice was a little hoarse. How can I not love you? She pressed her face against Tang Xin's little face. Her heart was heavy and soft. Finally, she said in a low voice, I love you. She loved Tang Xin. She loved this little girl who had the same blood as her. Now, she could finally say it. Perhaps this was the only time in her life that she could say it. Tang Xin felt a little embarrassed with her face pressed against her. Her little face was a little red. Don't love me too much. Thinking of this, she felt a little sad. Chichi, don't love me too much. I'm afraid that I won't live long and you'll be too sad. So, just a little bit of love is enough. Pei Chichi sensed that she was sad. Her heart was also heavy, but she didn't leave immediately. She accompanied Tang Xin for a while and waited until Tang Yu finished his breakfast. Then, they left together. Tang Xin lay on the sofa and looked at their backs. Pei Chichi knew that Tang Xin couldn't bear to leave, but she still hardened her heart and left. Before getting into the car, she looked at Tang Yu. Her voice was a little low and hoarse. Is there no way? Medical science is so advanced now. She knew it was shameful for her to beg him, but she also understood that if Tang Yu couldn't do it, she couldn't do it either. Tang Yu's fingers were on the car door. When he heard her speak, he let go and turned to look at her. His voice was indifferent. She's my sister. Of course, I'll think of a way. I will do my best. Mr. Tang really didn't lie to Pei Chichi. Last night, he really tried his best to sow seeds in her body. The author laughs shamelessly. Pei Chichi looked at him deeply. After a while, she said softly with difficulty, although she is Zhao Ke's daughter, she is innocent. Don't anger her. Tang Yu's gaze became unfathomable. He looked at her with a burning gaze, but his voice was slow. Pei Chichi, you know that Tang Xin is innocent. What about you? You're also Zhao Ke's daughter. Is that a crime? She was stunned. After a while, she said, that's not the same. Tang Xin was Tang Jiyuan's daughter and Tang Yu's sister. That couldn't be changed. But if she and Tang Yu were together, then what she had to face, and what Tang Yu had to face, was not just this little bit of kinship. What's the difference? Tang Yu sneered. He didn't walk over. He just leaned on the car door. The difference is that you're timid. He was not in a hurry. He would force her to have nowhere to run. He would force her to crawl to him and beg him. Sometimes, Tang Yu felt that he was a pervert. But his perversion, his thoughts, had always been on her alone. But she didn't understand. Chapter 443. However, it didn't matter. He would teach her slowly. He would teach her what she didn't know. She wouldn't. He would force her to learn. If she didn't dare to do it, he would force her to. She even dared to kill someone with a borrowed knife. Pei Chichi, why wouldn't you dare to be with me? One day, you will dare to do it. One day, you will dare to tell the whole world that you love me, that you can't live without me, and that you will crazily want to possess me. It's quite perverted. Pei Chichi's lips moved, but she didn't say anything in the end. She opened the car door and got into the car. However, she didn't expect Tang Yu to get into her car as well. Mr. Tang sat beside her and said calmly, send me to Shengyuan first. Pei Chichi sat there without moving. After calming down for a while, she turned her head and looked at Tang Yu, who was dressed in noble clothes. Mr. Tang, if I remember correctly, you are now scheming to buy my company. Now, you want me to send you to Shengyuan. Don't you think that's a little too much? Tang Yu smiled faintly. Boss Pei, firstly, I overdid it last night. I'm a little exhausted. Secondly, too much. Didn't you moan happily when you lay under a different body last night? Pei Chichi was a little angry as she glared at him. Boss Pei, you're a completely different person from last night. I still miss that little wild cat last night. He chuckled softly. What they were doing now was more intense than before. It was probably because they were enemies now. That was why she was more excited than before. However, This was the best aphrodisiac for a man. It would only make him want to eat her up more intensely. Pei Chichi didn't say anything else. She started the car and sent him to Shengyuan as fast as she could. However, Pei Chichi felt that she was too naive when she reached the entrance of Shengyuan. There were 2 long rows of employees at the entrance of Shengyuan. They stood straight as if they were receiving some important politicians. Her car drove over and stopped right in front of them. Just like that, Tang Yu got out of the car. He was noble and elegant, and his elegance was unparalleled. He did not leave immediately. Instead, he bent down and looked Pei Chichi in the eyes. "Boss Pei, I forgot to tell you something. The main topic of Shengyuan's meeting this morning is how to acquire the Pei Corporation as quickly as possible." Pei Chichi couldn't stand it any longer. She opened the door and got out. She locked eyes with him, right in front of his employees. Mr. Tang was still smiling, but Pei Chichi kicked him angrily. What she didn't know was that her clothes didn't hide anything. The kiss marks on her neck were clearly visible. What was worse was that there were reporters at the scene. Looking at the state of the two, the reporters later interviewed Mr. Tang and Pei Chichi respectively. This was what Pei Chichi had said: he had split into 2. Shameless. Mr. Tang smiled indifferently. This was called love. Interesting. At that moment, Pei Chichi was furious. She didn't care for long. She only felt satisfied after kicking him. She closed the car door and was about to leave. However, Tang Yu grabbed the car door and said in a low voice, "Pei Chichi, do you know who sprayed your car during Chinese New Year? Do you know that you smashed Shengyuan's LCD screen on Chinese New Year's Eve?" As she stared at him in shock, he said happily and meaningfully, "Boss Pei, the reunion dinner that night must have been delicious, right? Chinese New Year's Eve dinner?" She was stunned. Chapter 444. Most importantly, she had dreamed that she had been shamelessly eating him. Their New Year's Eve dinner. There. Pei Chichi's expression froze. She stared blankly and couldn't come back to her senses for a long time. Did she really do that to him that night? But she was only shocked for a moment before she realized all this while he had known about it. He had been playing with her. Pei Chichi was a little embarrassed and started the car quickly. Mr. Tang stood there and watched. He didn't say anything, but the corners of his lips curled up slightly. Meng Qingcheng seemed to have watched a good show. He walked over and chuckled. "Tang Yu, it looks like it was very intense last night. Do you have nothing else to do?" Tang Yu glanced at him and walked towards the hall. The employees on both sides bowed and said in unison, "Good morning, CEO." Tang Yu walked straight to the elevator. Meng Qingcheng followed him and coughed lightly. "Are you serious? Are you really going to acquire it?" Tang Yu stood straight and straightened his shirt in front of the mirror. He also slightly covered the kiss mark on his neck. Actually, his body wasn't any better than Pei Chichi's. Her little hands and mouth had also left quite a few marks on his body. Meng Qingcheng's sharp eyes saw it. He instantly became very excited. "Tang Yu, are you really going to let her do that to your body?" Tang Yu tilted his head to look at himself in the mirror and said indifferently, "Why not?" His gaze shifted to Meng Qingcheng in the mirror. "Qingcheng, you don't have a woman. You don't understand." This was called sexual interest. Meng Qingcheng was a little angry. Why didn't he understand? Wasn't it just kissing, nibbling, and then doing something dirty? But he couldn't tell that Tang Yu had such a heavy taste. He looked like he was enjoying it. But it didn't look like it. In any case, Meng Qingcheng felt that there was no one else in the world who would want to buy over someone else's company and get together with them at the same time. Perhaps in Tang Yu's eyes, it was called love and hate in Meng Qingcheng's eyes. Most people in Shengyuan Pavilion thought that Tang Yu was just trying to scare Pei Chichi, so no one took it seriously. However, at today's regular meeting, everyone from the senior management to the receptionist knew that Tang Yu had really decided to acquire the Pei Group. They were all stunned. After the meeting, Tang Yu returned to his office. Meng Qingcheng placed both hands on the table. "What if the acquisition is successful, and Pei Chichi still refuses to return to your side?" "She won't let me succeed." Mr. Tang sat behind his desk and flipped through some documents. By the way, I'm going to set up a team to deal with the acquisition of Pei Corporation. He looked up. Ching Cheng, you'll be the team leader. Meng Ching Cheng almost jumped up from his seat. Team leader? The team leader of the flirting team, right? What kind of family was this? But Meng Ching Cheng was powerless to stop him. Boss had the final say. This is training. Tang Yu suddenly chuckled. Meng Ching Cheng thought he had heard wrongly. Training? Do I, Meng Ching Cheng, need such training? Were they looking down on him too much? He wasn't boasting, but if he really took action, Pei Chichi wouldn't be able to last more than a few months. Tang Yu looked down and said softly, "It's Pei Chichi." He wanted her to be indestructible. He wanted her to not get hurt so easily. He wanted her to be able to walk up to him and say, "Tang Yu, I want you." Chapter 445. Because of Tang Yu's orders, one of Sheng Yuan's teams had been harassing the Pei group day in and day out. In half a month, Pei Chichi had lost a lot of weight. Her waist was much thinner, and her small face was the size of a palm with big eyes. She looked even more lovable. Every day, she slept less than 6 hours and spent the rest of her time visiting clients. She was rejected time and time again. Since Sheng Yuan was going to acquire the Pei group, who would dare to do business with them? When Tang Xin saw Pei Chichi again, she was stunned. She held Pei Chichi's hand and said, "Chichi, why have you lost so much weight?" They sat on the sofa while Tang Yu sat in front of the piano in front of the French window, playing a song. Pei Chichi was distracted and could tell that it was Fur Elise. Tang Xin pulled her gaze back and pursed her lips. She said unhappily, "Chichi, look, your hair isn't as black and shiny anymore." Tang Yu couldn't help but look. Pei Chichi touched her hair and said, "Oh." Tang Xin pouted. "Also, look at your waist. It's very thin, but your butt isn't perky anymore. Also, it's not as big as it used to be." "Not perky anymore? Not big anymore?" Tang Yu closed the lid of the piano and turned his head. He looked at Pei Chichi with a burning gaze. He could see it clearly from top to bottom. It was a little small. Should he let Ching Cheng relax a little and let Pei Chichi gain some weight? Mr. Tang touched his chin and thought seriously. Because this would affect his sense of touch and satisfaction, he liked Pei Chichi's figure. He liked how full it was. Although it wasn't very full, it was just right and he could control it with one hand. As for whether it was perky or not, for a man, the visual impact was very important when he looked at it from behind. He watched quietly. After a long time, Pei Chichi also felt his gaze and looked over. Then, Pei Chichi pursed her lips and did not say a word. She saw the hope in his eyes. Tang Xin looked at them and then at the other one. She felt that something was amiss. There seemed to be something wrong with her brother and Chi Chi. The last time they slept together, they were naked and did not wear any clothes. But today, when Chi Chi came here, she was very cold to her brother and did not even say a word. Tang Xin stared at him anxiously. However, Chi Chi was very calm and even made some snacks for her. She didn't seem to be angry. Tang Xin happily ate as she stared at Pei Chichi. She couldn't help but feel a little nervous. "Chichi, it's Saturday today. Will you be staying?" Tang Xin licked her fingers as she finished a bag of snacks like a mouse. "Yeah, I have a social engagement tonight." Pei Chichi's voice was very soft. She reached out and patted Tang Xin's head. Tang Xin was a little disappointed. She looked at her anxiously. "Chichi, can't you cancel it? The company isn't doing well recently. It's being maliciously suppressed." Pei Chichi smiled. She purposely said it for Tang Yu to hear. Mr. Tang finally stopped his fantasizing. He opened the lid of the guqin and started playing again. He said in a low voice, "Pei Chichi, you can also ask me for help." Pei Chichi didn't say anything. Instead, Tang Xin ran over and hugged Tang Yu's arm. She said softly, "Brother, help me." Tang Yu continued playing the guqin. He answered Tang Xin, "Your Chichi might not need it." Chapter 446. Mr. Tang chuckled. Peichichi, Tang Xin said that you need it. Really? If you need it, I can help. At that moment, Peichichi felt that Tang Yu could go to the toilet. That was too shameless. Tang Xin was clapping her hands. Of course, Chichi needs it. Tang Xin. Peichichi could not help but roll her eyes. I don't need it. Tang Yu played the guqin and said with a smile, don't forget to look for me when you need it. Peichichi ran over and lay on the other side of his neck. Just by lying on his neck, he had goosebumps all over his body. It had been a long time since she took the initiative to approach him when she was sober. Her long hair was scattered on his neck. It was a little ticklish, but it was indescribably soft and beautiful. Of course, as a man, he could acutely feel the changes in her. She was much thinner than before. She lay on his shoulder very lightly. I'll definitely look for you. Peichichi whispered in his ear. Then, she buried her whole body and bit him hard. Tang Yu's whole body went numb. He was stiff and unable to react. That little mouth of hers was still biting his neck. It was painful, but the pain was also sweet. So, when Peichichi felt that she was about to wake up, he quickly pressed her down with one hand and said in a low voice, "You want to run now?" She was pressed down by him and could not move. She was a little embarrassed. Tang Xin just stared at him and swallowed her saliva. Brother is so rough. Tang Yu looked at his sister and said in a low voice, "Didn't you say you want me to help her? Go upstairs." Tang Xin looked at him and felt that she had to do something for Chichi. She went upstairs obediently so that Chichi would put down her pride and beg her brother. Yes, that's it. Thus, Tang Xin obediently went upstairs. Peichichi almost fainted from anger. Tang Yu tilted his head slightly. Tang Xin, don't peek. On the stairs, Tang Xin let out a cry, followed by the sound of footsteps running away. Peichichi waited until Tang Xin was far away before she gritted her teeth. Tang Yu, let go of me. When he loosened his grip, he let go of her, but he placed her on the piano. That clear and dull sound startled her. She screamed and instinctively hugged his body. Just as he was about to let go of her, his body fell heavily back onto the ground. He pressed her down with one hand to prevent her from getting up and leaned over slightly. Boss Pei, didn't you say that you wanted me to do it? She kicked him angrily, but Tang Yu quickly caught her foot. The next second, she threw her shoe on the ground. Those white and tender little feet were extremely adorable. His slender fingers slowly caressed her little feet and his voice was mesmerizing. Is this how you beg people, Boss Pei? Peichichi sat on the piano with one of her feet in his hand. She looked indescribably fragile. Peichichi, you can really beg me. He pulled her slightly, and she slid straight into his arms. She sat in his arms in an extremely uncomfortable position, and their bodies were pressed tightly against each other. She could even feel the changes in him. She turned her face away awkwardly. Tang Yu, don't go overboard. He looked at her fixedly, his thin lips slightly pursed, and after a while, he suddenly let go of her. The sudden loss of warmth made her feel a little empty. Chapter 447. She was stunned for a moment and then looked up at him. Her back was pressed against the piano, and it was very hard and uncomfortable. However, she did not dare to move because she knew that if she moved, he would want her. At this moment, Tang Yu could not bear the slightest provocation. Peichichi, you've grown up. He looked at her pathetic state and smiled faintly. Doesn't President Pei have a social engagement? I won't see you out. She was stunned. He was letting her go just like that. Tang Yu's handsome face was mocking. President Pei, do you need me now? She kicked him with her bare foot again. This time, he did not dodge, so she kicked him. Tang Yu glared at her. She bit her lips and did not dare to speak for a long time. She could only look at his livid face. Tang Yu's expression softened. Peichichi, don't you want to leave? His tone was very calm, but at that moment, she felt an indescribable pain. It was as if she could feel the infinite sadness in his heart. They had unknowingly reached this stage between them. At this moment, they were right in front of each other. They were so close, but the sweet past could only be rewound like a videotape. Their eyes were glued to each other. After a long time, Tang Yu sighed softly. Pei Chichi, go. Leave this place before I change my mind, otherwise, I will want to tear your clothes off on this piano and have sex with you. There was a hint of warmth in her eyes as she looked at him. Her fingers trembled uncontrollably as they caressed the side of his face. It was warm as always. Her fingers touched his face gently, slowly at first, and then hurriedly. She caressed his face carefully. Tang Yu allowed her to touch him. After a long time, he said hoarsely, Pei Chichi, if you don't want to return to my side, you don't need this kind of warmth. He suddenly put her down and used one long leg to hold her body in place so that she could not struggle. She lay on her back hopelessly and looked at the man above her. His face was solemn, his jaw tensed. Pei Chichi, we don't have to do this. His dark eyes were bottomless as he stared at her. She felt as if she was being sucked in, and her body could not move at all. Tang Yu. Her voice was fragile, like a kitten's meowing. She longed for him very much. That kind of oppression almost drove her crazy. She pretended not to care, pretended that it had nothing to do with him, pretended that she could. But every night, her heart and her body were telling her she missed him. Tang Yu. She called out to him again pitifully. He looked at her cruelly. Pei Chichi, if you can't do it, don't give me hope. Then, I will use my own way. She looked into his eyes and saw nothing but coldness. She knew that he could be more ruthless than anyone else, he could pamper her to the extreme, but he could also drag her down to hell. Pei Chichi closed her eyes. Tang Yu, let go of me. A trace of desolation flashed past his eyes. He lifted his body slightly and slowly let go of her. In just a moment, he adjusted his emotions and looked at her quietly for a while before he got up and went upstairs. When he was halfway up the spiral staircase, he paused and turned around. Pei Chichi was still sitting there in a daze. Chapter 448. Pei Chichi propped herself up and looked at him. She said numbly, it's fine. I drove here myself. He looked at her for a moment and spat out a few cold words, up to you. Just like that, Pei Chichi watched him walk all the way up the stairs. Her body was still floating and could not support her standing. She slowly slid down and fell to the ground. She didn't remember how she walked out, and she didn't know how she drove her car. She only knew that her car drove into his lawn and crushed a large patch of roses. Pei Chichi sat in the car, confused. When she reversed the car, she crushed a large patch of roses. Tang Yu stood on the second floor and watched without any expression on his face. Tang Xin cupped her little face and said, Brother, Chichi is so rough. After a while, she mustered up her courage and asked, Does Chichi also crush you like this? Her mind was filled with bloody scenes. She was just a kid. But in Tang Yu's mind, it was all yellow. He was a man after all. He could not tell Tang Xin that her Chichi did not like to be on the top. She was lazy and usually liked to be on the bottom. And he liked to do it from the back. His gaze was somewhat unfathomable. The reason why he let her go today was because he was not in a good mood. It was not that he was not interested, but he was angry with her. Tang Xin raised her head and looked at her noble brother. Brother, you let Chichi go. She will come back, Tang Yu said and walked towards the study. Tang Xin immediately followed. Brother, how did you know? Tell me. When will Chichi come back? Brother, is it because Chichi does not want to sleep with you naked? The elder brother finally stopped in his tracks and turned to look at the talkative little guy. You talk too much. Tang Xin stuck out her tongue and did not dare to say anything else. After Tang Yu entered the study, she stuck out her tongue and put on a face. You're such a hypocrite. Actually, I just want Chichi to pressure me a little. Tang Yu had just closed the door. He shook his head when he heard Tang Xin's words. In fact, Tang Xin was right. He did have some deep-rooted bad habits. Although he wasn't as lecherous as Ching Cheng, he had a strong interest in Pei Chichi's body. It was as if he was possessed. 10 o'clock at night, in a private room of a famous hotel. Little Wen looked at Pei Chichi worriedly and whispered, Boss Pei, you can't drink. In fact, it was just a case of 1 or 2 million yuan. In the past, Boss Pei would not have bought it. A small lousy company actually dared to put on airs and tell Boss Pei that he would sign the contract if he drank this glass of wine. Little Wen was cursing in her heart, but she did not dare to say anything. After all, Boss Pei needed clients now. No matter how young they were, they still cared. Pei Chichi looked at the glass of golden brandy in front of her. She stared blankly and picked it up. Boss Pei, you'll get drunk if you drink this. Little Wen said worriedly. Her heart ached because Boss Pei was only 21 years old and had not graduated from university. Pei Chichi shook her head. Little Wen, I'm fine. Little Wen stepped forward. Boss Pei, I'll drink this glass of wine on your behalf. On top of that, I'll drink 2 glasses to show my sincerity. She snatched the glass from Pei Chichi's hand and drank it in one gulp. Chapter 449. At the table, the boss of the other company was probably in a good mood as he clapped his hands in satisfaction. Secretary Xiao Wen has a good alcohol tolerance and is even more loyal. It's really something to be happy about for Boss Pei to have such a trusted subordinate. No matter what, we have to have a drink on such a happy occasion. As he spoke, he had already filled the glass that Xiao Wen had put down silently. Xiao Wen was about to take it when Pei Chichi reached out to stop her. She smiled faintly. Let me drink. She looked at the 2 bosses as she slowly drank the wine in the glass. Can we sign the contract now? She instructed Xiao Wen to take out the contract and buckled it there. Vice President Cheng, Boss Li wouldn't make fun of us, would he? In that case, the 2 bosses could not say anything because they had agreed to sign the contract after drinking this glass of wine. It was originally a difficult situation, but the 2 girls drank it without blinking. Now, the younger generation really had to surpass the older generation. What's more, they were 2 young girls. His face tensed up, but he still signed it. Although the young girls in front of them were quite pretty, or rather very pretty, they did not dare to touch them. They just said a few words and left. Once they left, Pei Chichi's body went completely limp. She looked at Xiao Wen. Are you all right? I'm fine, I have a high alcohol tolerance. Xiao Wen shook her head. Boss Pei, how about you? Pei Chichi leaned against the back of the chair. I'm going to the washroom to vomit. The alcohol was very strong, and her stomach could not take it at all. Now, she felt as uncomfortable as if she was on fire. Xiao Wen wanted to help her up, but Pei Chichi insisted on going in alone. She vomited until her stomach acid was about to come out. Xiao Wen had already asked the waiter to send some tea to relieve the alcohol. Be careful, it's hot. Drink a little and you'll feel better. I'll send you back later and cook some porridge for you. Pei Chichi sipped it in small mouthfuls. Her mind was still clear. No need. Although she was a little weak now, her mind was very clear. Xiao Wen was worried and rested for a while. Seeing that she was fine, she left at the door. Pei Chichi wanted to walk for a while, but she only felt more comfortable when the wind was blowing. In the bag he was carrying, there were contracts worth more than 1 million yuan. She felt a little ironic. Or rather, it was the reality after leaving Tangyu. Drinking like crazy to get a contract, the 2 of them were considered good today. She knew in her heart that the worst was yet to come, however, she had no way out. A noble figure stood under the streetlight in front. Pei Chichi blinked, thinking that she was seeing things. However, the one in front of him was still him, still Tangyu. His dark eyes locked onto hers, attracting her like a pair of deep pools. Even her body was slightly trembling. She looked at him like that, and then suddenly turned and ran as fast as she could in the other direction. She was afraid that if she went there, she would never be able to bear to leave. In just a few steps, an arm grabbed her body and pulled her into his embrace. Immediately, he smelled the alcohol in her mouth and frowned. You drank? Pei Chichi's body didn't move at all. She looked up at him and said in a sharp voice, Yes, I drank. Suddenly, she chuckled and tilted her head. Mr. Tang, don't you want to know why I drank? He frowned even more. Pei Chichi's fingers trembled as she took out the contract from her bag and threw it to him. 1. 5 million yuan. Xiao Wen and I drank a whole glass of brandy each. Chapter 450. Tang Yu read through the document, memorized the information on it, and returned it to her. His tone was a little indifferent. You don't have to drink it. Yes, I don't have to drink it. I'll watch the company close down because of poor management and get acquired. She looked into his eyes. Tang Yu, you're born into a wealthy family and you've received the best education. You can get anything you want. But I'm different. You haven't experienced my life, so you don't know. She looked up and blinked away the tears in her eyes. How difficult is it for a person who hasn't even graduated from university to manage a company? And now, thanks to you, the whole world knows that the Pei Corporation is a piece of meat in Xing Yuan's mouth. She sneered. Of course you don't know the feeling of fear, because you're so high and mighty. You've always stood at the highest point and looked down on everyone. When he loved her, he treated her like a little sweetheart, a little baby. Now that she wasn't willing to be by his side, she was his enemy, and he wouldn't stop until he killed her. Tang Yu looked at her and didn't say a word. It was early spring, and the weather was very cold. Late at night, it started to drizzle again. She stared at him for a long time, and a trace of bitterness appeared at the corner of her mouth. She took 2 steps back and said in a weak voice, Tang Yu, let's just do this. She closed her eyes. Let's just do this. She turned around, but he immediately hugged her from behind. The drizzle was like silk, and both their clothes were slightly wet. It was actually not comfortable to hug each other like this. It was a little warm and a little humid, and it was hot and humid. Tang Yu buried his face in her little neck. Pei Chichi, but I don't want to let you go. At this moment, perhaps it was because of anger, or perhaps it was because she had drunk, Pei Chichi's little universe exploded. She turned around and slapped him. Tang Yu's handsome face was firmly slapped, and she was panting violently because she had used too much force, and there was a hint of fear in her eyes. Tang Yu didn't care about his own face, and his arm was so strong that it almost broke her waist. There was rain on his face, as well as on his eyelashes, which made him look even more unfathomable. Pei Chichi lifted her face, her shoulders were pressed down by him. Her red lips trembled. Are you going to hit me back? He stared at her and slowly said, Pei Chichi, when did I become a man who hits a woman in your heart? He did hit her once, and that was the only time. He had promised himself that he would not be rough with her in the future. Pei Chichi's body trembled slightly as she pursed her lips tightly. Only the raindrops flowed down her cheeks. Finally, she said in a trembling voice, Tang Yu, can you let me go? Then who will let me go? He pressed down on her shoulders and said in a desolate tone, Pei Chichi, when you hugged me and said you loved me, did you let me go? It was never me who didn't let you off. He pointed at his heart. It's always been you who won't let me go. He laughed coldly. You're afraid, you're worried, and you're backing down. Have you really loved me before? Pei Chichi, tell me, do you love me? The raindrops fell on her face and her eyes were misty. She could no longer tell which was the rain and which was the tears. She did not make a sound and looked up. In her heart, she loved him 1,000 times. But it was hard for her to say it out loud. Tang Yu, do you know that we won't be happy? She took a step back and finally broke down. She looked at him with tears streaming down her face. Tang Yu, why do you have to force me? Why? She hugged her head, feeling very cold. I admit that I'm not brave enough. She closed her eyes and tears rolled down her cheeks one by one. Those tears seemed to flow into Tang Yu's heart. It was sour and uncomfortable. She lifted her head slowly and looked into his eyes. She said firmly, but I love you. There was no other love like her, humble, weak, and looked up to. Just as she finished speaking, her body was pulled into a burning embrace and she was kissed forcefully. The author's words, when will be published tomorrow. Thank you for your company. Yaro Yaro thought, 460,000 words for free is enough to show my sincerity. I hope that after it's published, everyone won't call the author a liar or something, because the author's job is to write books to earn money to support their families and cat. This book is the one that Yaro Yaro has put the most effort into writing. I hope that everyone can continue to support me. It doesn't cost much. Updating 10,000 words every day only costs a few cents. There are also free scrolls that you can use. For those who can't continue to support me. Yao Yao also thanks everyone for your long-term companionship. Thank everyone for voting for me all the time. Thank you to everyone who has tipped me. There's nothing I can do to repay you, so thank you. Chapter 451. That kiss was just as hot and scorching as his body. She was so hot that she almost jumped. She wanted to move, but her body was surrounded by hot iron. She couldn't move. He kissed her deeply, as if he wanted to melt her whole body into his. Peichichi, what should I do with you? I tortured you, I forced you, but in the end, I found out that I was the one who was torturing and forcing me. He had too many unreconciled feelings, and all these unreconciled feelings turned into a scorching kiss. Her face was flushed and her heart was racing. Her soft moans were crushed by his lips and tongue. She swallowed her breath. Around them, there was the sound of car horns and men's whistles. However, those sounds seemed to come from thousands of miles away. In their world, there was only that small world left. His breath infected her in a domineering manner, so hot and humid that she couldn't tell who was whose. There was only the sound of each other's breathing and their heartbeats. Their hearts were so hot that they felt as if they were about to jump out of their chests. They were pressed against each other, and their hearts were beating just as fast. When his lips left her, her little mouth was slightly swollen. She was kissed so hard that she looked at him in a daze. He was the same. His breathing was slightly chaotic, and he wasn't as calm as he usually was. Peichichi, you're the one who said you loved me. He suddenly grabbed her wrist and said coldly. But his palm was so hot. Peichichi instinctively wanted to withdraw her hand, but he had already dragged her to the nearest hotel. It wasn't a top-notch hotel. It was just a 4-star hotel. But at this moment, he didn't have time to care so much. He dragged her to the front desk, took out his wallet from his pocket and threw it on the front desk. Get the best suite. The front desk receptionist was shocked. When she looked up and saw Tang Yu, she felt that he looked familiar, but a second later, she remembered something. God, he was actually the CEO of Shengyuan, but now, he was actually dragging a young lady to the K-room of their hotel. This young lady looked so young and delicate, hence, the front desk receptionist's sense of justice came out. She asked in a trembling voice, "Do you have a marriage certificate?" Tang Yu lowered his head and looked at Peichichi. "She's my girlfriend." Peichichi was trapped by him and could not move, but she did not make a sound. Because it was too embarrassing. Seeing that she did not resist, the receptionist could not say anything else. She took out 2,000 yuan from her wallet and booked the best room. She also completed the procedures as quickly as possible. Tang Yu held the room card and dragged Peichichi into the elevator. As soon as they entered, he pushed her against the wall and used his body to block the camera as he kissed her. When the elevator arrived, he did not stop. Just like that, they hugged and kissed as they stumbled to the door of the suite. He quickly swiped open the door and carried her to the bedroom. Peichichi was thrown onto the king-sized luxurious bed by him. Her pure white face, with her long black hair, was breathtakingly beautiful. Tang Yu didn't have sex with her immediately. He just stood at the head of the bed and gently unbuttoned his shirt. Peichichi's eyes were filled with a layer of mist as she gazed at him. She also desired him. This was a fire that was lit in the middle of the night. If it was not extinguished, both of them would feel uncomfortable. Hence, she crawled towards him like a kitten, her little hand pressing on his finger that was unbuckling his belt. "Let me do it." Her voice was soft, but there was a hint of hoarseness in it. Chapter 452. Tang Yu grabbed her arm, his voice a little hoarse. "Peichichi, are you sure?" She knelt in front of him, her face only reaching his waist. At this moment, her face was buried and fluffy. It was a little cute and a little seductive. She looked up at him, her mouth slightly open. That absent-minded look made him want to kill her. Tang Yu reached out and caressed her face gently. He said slowly, Pei Chichi, what do you want to do to me? In his mind, he imagined the scene when she was drunk the last time. He only felt his heart skip a beat. When he looked down again, he saw her little head. He groaned embarrassedly. After a long while, he grabbed her little head and pressed her into his arms. After resting for a while, he pressed her down and came at her fiercely, until he was completely exhausted. The first ray of sunlight shone into the bedroom. Tang Yu opened his eyes uncomfortably and saw Pei Chichi kneeling on the sofa in her bathrobe, drying her clothes with a hairdryer. She had no idea how much he had seen when she was kneeling with her back facing him and there was nothing inside her bathrobe. Tang Yu leaned against the headboard and looked at her back view quietly. He even felt a little greedy. It seemed like he had not been with her for a long time. It was just the two of them. Last night, she said that she loved him. The corner of Tang Yu's mouth turned up slightly, his expression gentle. Pei Chichi finished drying her clothes and carefully put on her underwear. When she took off her bathrobe, she heard a soft gasp. She hugged the bathrobe and turned around. At this moment, she was really beautiful. Her long black hair fell on her thin shoulders. The morning light shone on her youthful figure, softening her perfect curves. She was bright and alluring. On her small oval face, there was a trace of moisture in her misty eyes. Her small mouth was bright red, and at this moment, she was biting her lower lip in disappointment. Tang Yu lifted the blanket and walked straight toward her. Pei Chichi stared at him with her eyes wide open. She moved her body, wanting to escape, but her legs were weak. Finally, he came to her side and gently removed the bathrobe from her hands. His black eyes were stained with a layer of something profound. It was somewhat clear, yet somewhat indistinct. When she realized what he wanted to do, Pei Chichi subconsciously wanted to escape, but her small body immediately fell into his arms again. She was hugged tightly by him. She closed her eyes and said in a trembling voice, Tang Yu, it's been too many times. He leaned in close to her, and she was afraid of his hot breath. Then, do it again, he whispered into her ear and carried her to the bathroom. Several more indescribable things took place there. When Tang Yu woke up again, it was already evening. The bedroom was very dark, only the faint sound of the central air conditioner could be heard. His hand reached to one side, and he caught nothing. The blanket was also cold. He propped himself up and looked beside him, only to see a strand of hair left on the pillow. Tang Yu picked it up and looked at it for a long time. Then, a cold smile appeared on his lips. What a coward! Just as he was about to get up, Pei Chichi came out of the bathroom, looking neat and tidy. Tang Yu leaned back again, a faint smile on his face. I thought you left. Chapter 453. Tang Yu looked at her without batting an eyelid. Pei Chichi patted his handsome face and took out 100 yuan from her purse. She placed it on his abdomen and said, This is your fare for the night. His muscular arm immediately grabbed her wrist and he said unhappily, Pei Chichi, am I only worth 100 yuan? From last night until today, he had served her at least 7 or 8 times. 100 yuan. That was not even 20 yuan each time. His dark eyes stared into her eyes. Pei Chichi, is it only worth 100 yuan for you to moan so happily? The gifted student Tang Yu had suffered an unprecedented blow. Last night, other than the first time when she had taken the initiative to serve him, he had been the one to serve her afterward. He had used all sorts of methods to make her happy. He had been so humble and subservient to make her happy, to make her tremble, to make her cry and scream. He was only worth 100 yuan. If 100 isn't enough, then 200. She generously placed another one on the table, and then looked at him with a smile. President Tang, you have to understand a small boss of a company that's being suppressed. Not everyone can be like you, spending 100 million to sleep with anyone they want to sleep with. His dark eyes were still locked on her. He felt that Pei Chichi was a little different. So, it's only 200. She wanted to leave after saying that, but Tang Yu held her back. He looked at her and said slowly, Pei Chichi, will you give me 200 yuan if I make love to you in the future? She was stunned. There seemed to be nothing wrong with his logic, but there seemed to be something wrong. She immediately understood and reached out to pat him. She picked up her purse and walked to the door. It depends on whether I'm willing to sleep with you or not. Tang Yu leaned against the wall and watched her leave, but he was in a good mood. His good mood continued until the customer service came, and his mood became even better. Pei Chichi had finally remembered to order a meal for him. Honestly, he did not force her to stay because, after a day, he was really a little exhausted. It wasn't easy for a man to do it many times in a night. It was normal for him to do it 3 or 4 times in a night, but he was also a little tired after what he did last night and today. After a simple meal, he returned to the rose garden. Tang Yu didn't expect that his mother, Lin Yun, would come and Tang Xin would still be there. Tang Xin had always been afraid of his mother, probably because of her guilty conscience. Lin Yun sat on the sofa while Tang Xin curled up on the other side. She pretended to be reading manga, but she was actually very nervous. Tang Yu walked over to Tang Xin, unbuttoning his jacket and tossing it to her. "Take it upstairs for me." "Oh," Tang Xin replied, as if a heavy burden had been lifted from her shoulders. She carried his clothes upstairs. Lin Yun didn't mean to make things difficult for her, but she really didn't want to see Tang Xin. Whenever she saw Tang Xin, she would be reminded of her lost child. Now that Tang Xin was upstairs, Tang Xin heaved a sigh of relief, but Lin Yun was also feeling better. Tang Yu walked over slowly and sat down on the sofa beside Lin Yun. When he leaned against the back of the sofa and the fabric of his clothes rubbed against each other. That sound made Lin Yun raise her eyebrows. Looking at her son, she felt an indescribable sense of contentment between his brows. Chapter 454. Lin Yun took a sip of tea and said indifferently, "You've met Pei Chichi?" Tang Yu smiled and didn't say anything, which was a tacit agreement. Lin Yun put down the teacup and restrained her expression. She said seriously, "I remember that Sheng Yuan is buying the Pei Corporation, right?" Tang Yu took a sip of tea to moisten his throat before answering his mother, "Yes." Lin Yun looked at his indifferent expression and felt a little angry. Her son had always been so outstanding, but he had done all sorts of stupid things with Pei Chichi. Buying women. Now he had caused such a big commotion. It would have been fine if it had been someone else, but it had to be Zhao Ke's daughter. This was something Lin Yun couldn't accept. "Tang Yu, what if I break up with Pei Chichi?" Lin Yun looked at her son and said seriously. Tang Yu slowly sat up straight, but he didn't say anything. He knew his mother well. It wasn't a smart move for him to express his stance now. Lin Yun continued, "There were too many people last time, so I didn't want to give you face. But Tang Yu, you know what I'm thinking." At this moment, Lin Yun was expressing her stance. Tang Yu wiped his face and lay back. He closed his eyes and said, "Mom, can we not talk about this? Did I spoil your good mood?" Lin Yun's voice was a little cold. "Tang Yu, others may not know, but I know it very well. What are you doing all this for?" "It's just to make me feel pity for Pei Chichi and soften my heart." Tang Yu smiled bitterly. "But Tang Yu, I don't care about anything else. I don't care even if Sheng Yuan has to be given to someone else. There's only one thing. My grandson can't have Zhao Ke's blood." Lin Yun closed her eyes. "I still remember the feeling of the child flowing out of my body." Tang Yu looked at his mother and said in a hoarse voice, "What if Chichi is pregnant? Are you going to let her experience the feeling of a child coming out of her body?" This time, Lin Yun was a little angry. She glared at Tang Yu. "If you don't do anything to make her pregnant, she won't get pregnant." She couldn't sit still anymore. She couldn't continue this conversation with Tang Yu. Tang Yu smiled. "I might not be able to hold myself back." No matter how good Lin Yun's upbringing was, it was ruined by this outstanding son of hers. For the first time, she lost her composure. She picked up her bag and said, "I'm leaving first." She was afraid that if she didn't leave, she would hit her. Tang Yu smiled and stood up. "I'll walk you out." Lin Yun was also furious. She turned her head to look at him and asked mockingly, "President Tang, you still have the strength to drive?" It had been a day and a night, and he was about to collapse. She knew that young people didn't know how to control themselves. She was also young, but this was her son and Zhao Ku's daughter. Thinking about it made her feel uncomfortable. It was rare for Tang Yu to see his mother like this. He held Lin Yun's shoulder with one hand and picked up the car keys with the other. Why would I? I'll always have the strength to serve you. Although his voice was calm, there was a hint of coaxing in it. Lin Yun was also a woman, and to her, Tang Yu was the most gentle weapon in the world. No mother could be indifferent to her handsome son, so she just glanced at him lightly. When did you learn all this? She paused for a moment. Don't think that I'll let you and Pei Chichi be together just because you're like this. Tang Yu laughed. How would I dare? Besides, Chichi doesn't want to be with me. Chapter 455. Everyone in B City knew how ruthless Tang Yu was to the young lady outside. He was playing this game with her behind her back. Chichi. How affectionate. At this moment, Lin Yun felt something in her heart. No matter how different Tang Yu was from Tang Jiyuan, he was still a man. Although they were mother and son, she knew him well. The woman that Tang Yu wanted, he probably couldn't give up. Lin Yun was conflicted. She didn't want to see her son suffer. Although Tang Yu didn't say it, she knew that he was in a difficult position. Sitting in the car, Lin Yun and Tang Yu were silent. Neither of them spoke. When they were about to reach Shui Yunfu, Lin Yun said, Tang Yu, this is the only thing that Mom can't help you with. Tang Yu's slender fingers gripped the steering wheel slightly. Just like his mother, he didn't want to hurt his mother the most in this world. So, he tortured Pei Chichi. Because she was the woman who had been with him for the rest of his life. He would have a lot of time to make it up to her. His mother, on the other hand, could only slowly heal her own wounds in the long years. I know. I can understand. He slowly stopped the car and looked at his mother. Mom, I don't want you to force yourself. Lin Yun sighed. She didn't have the energy to be angry now. Tang Yu got out of the car, opened the door for her, and personally sent her into the hall. Lin Yun stopped and turned back. You followed me all the way here. You must have something to say, right? Tang Yu smiled bitterly. Yes. After a moment of silence, he continued, Chichi isn't doing well. I think you know that too. Her birth was a tragedy, but for Tang Yu, it was just right. They just happened to meet. That night, he was drunk, but he could still remember that she was covered in a thin layer of sweat and timidly pressed her hot little lips against his. It was rough and seductive. Lin Yun's expression didn't change. She had always been indifferent, and these things couldn't move her. In the past, she did like Pei Chichi, but with Zhao Ku around, even Tang Xin was like this, let alone Pei Chichi. Becoming a wife was something he absolutely could not accept. Mom, I just want you to know that I was the one who pestered her. I was the one who didn't let her go. I forced her to do whatever she did with me. Tang Yu's voice was a little soft. Don't vent your anger on her just because she's Zhao Ku's daughter. Lin Yun always had a good temper, especially in front of Tang Yu. She never spoke loudly. At this moment, she was also a little angry, and her expression was a little cold. Tang Yu, when did I vent my anger on her? If you want to talk about venting your anger, then I won't be like this. But you looked for her, didn't you? Tang Yu smiled faintly. Lin Yun was stunned, and asked unhappily, did Pei Chichi tell you that? Tang Yu pursed his lips, and his voice was a little hoarse. No, I just know you. He went forward and hugged Lin Yun, his tall and slender body bent slightly, and he buried his face in Lin Yun's neck. Mom, I'm so sorry for hurting you. His voice was a little hoarse. Lin Yun was a little moved. Tang Yu had always been precocious, and she couldn't remember when he had acted like this. It was a sign of weakness, and also a form of pleading. Tang Yu couldn't say it out loud, so he used this method to soften it. Lin Yun's eyes were red, and she took a while to control herself. She hit Tang Yu's shoulder. You brat, I won't fall for this. You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.